Okay, welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us for the next hour. This discussion is called Guns in Government, Leaders and Legislators Roundtable. We're going to talk about some of the local and state level and federal level discussions that are going on, where elected officials and community advocates who are at the forefront of addressing gun violence in their communities will talk about some of the work that they are doing, advocating for and implementing legislation and policies and programs that seek to reduce the harms caused by gun violence. And there'll be a special focus throughout on the role that the media plays both in framing and covering and advancing the discussion of these very important issues. My name is Errol Lewis. I am a political anchor at Spectrum News. I'm based in New York, at New York One, here in New York City. But Spectrum News is a national organization with channels all over the country, including Hawaii, Maine, California, Texas, Wisconsin, Florida. You get the picture. Joining me is a really great panel of some legislative and local leaders. There have been some changes in the program. We're doing this live, and these panelists are taking time from their busy schedules to join us. And of course, there have been some events in the world that you have probably heard about that made us have to change some things up a little bit. So we have John Carter joining us. He's a legislative assistant to Representative Maxwell Frost of Florida, who, as you know, along with other members of Congress, have been wrapped up in some drama down in Washington, D.C., where they voted out a Speaker of the House for the very first time. Representative Jennifer Longdon is with us. She is a state representative from Arizona's District 24, which includes all or part of Central Phoenix and South Scottsdale. We have with us as well Sasha, who's a senior strategy director of the National Network for Safe Communities. It's based there at John Jay. And before starting the National Network for Safe Communities, she worked as a director of the Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention. That's inside the Minneapolis Health Department. And last but not least, Michael Sean Spence is the managing director of community safety initiatives at Everytown for gun safety. And we certainly welcome him as well and his perspective. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into it. The chat function is where you should put any questions that you have, and we will get to those and invite you into the conversation shortly. But John Carter, let me start with you. The first bill introduced by Representative Frost was the Office of Gun Violence Prevention Act, which was intended to convene local leaders impacted by gun violence with federal agencies to advance policy, collect and report data, expand state and local outreach, and so forth. How did that issue figure into Representative Frost? I mean, it was the very first thing he did, which is meaningful. Was this a reaction to specific events in the district? And what are constituents saying about gun violence in the district?
Yeah, thanks, Errol, for that question. I first want to say thanks for holding this panel. I am truly sorry that the Congressman was not able to make it, and that y'all have welcomed me to stand in for him on such short notice. Of course, as you mentioned, we are dealing with some quite unprecedented turmoil right now in Congress. So just really grateful to be here. So the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, we were really excited about it from the get-go. It was one of the big asks of a lot of community groups that have been really involved in the gun violence prevention space, particularly March for Our Lives. And so I think it's really important that we think about how that came to be, because in the way that we've constructed this panel right now, where we have local, state, and federal and community organizations represented, it really was all of those entities from all of those levels that kind of played a role in getting the Office of Gun Violence Prevention across the finish line. So we worked with local entities, community organizations who would lobby there, and other state organizations. It really was a full court press in response to. I mean, you can't anymore say in response to a particular shooting, unfortunately. It's in response to inaction, right? And so I think what we're really excited about is being able to have this office that can really show that we expect will be able to really show some really strong evidence for a lot of the policies that we're hoping to move forward, that where there's been, unfortunately, at least at the federal level, not as much progress as is needed.
And so, John, what's the sort of the theory of change? Is the idea that this Office of Gun Violence Prevention will collect data, clarify some policy initiatives, point to best practices, and then what happens? How does the change get made?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think you really pointed to the. I would like to think that there are three major components to how we view the Office of Gun Violence Prevention's role in change in this space. And I think as you highlighted, one is collection and analysis of data related to different types of gun violence prevention policies, and that's not just the ones that a lot of the activist groups on the ground have been calling for, but also types of policies that opponents of major gun violence prevention reform have suggested in their place, right? I think it's important to get the data on whether and if it isn't as effective for alternative kinds of policies. I think that this office will be able to have that data, provide those analyses, and then more provide policy recommendations, as you mentioned. And then it also has a function of providing education, right? And by education, we mean public outreach, publications, making these policy recommendations available to the public, because it's not just policy recommendations made to lawmakers that makes change happen, right? It's when the public has access to this information and they organize. And my boss is really, really committed to the idea that when the community has access to this information, they are much more influential than any one or two lawmakers.
Okay. Let me move on and invite Representative Longdon into the conversation. And you aren't just an elected lawmaker. You've encountered gun violence personally, having been struck in a random shooting in 2004. Can you tell us a little bit about the situation in Arizona?
Thanks for that, Errol. And again, I'm really honored to be here and thank our sponsors for putting this panel together. I was paralyzed 19 years ago in a random shooting on my way to get dinner with my fiance. We were holding hands, making wedding plans. And what folks can't see on Zoom is that I'm a full-time wheelchair user. I was paralyzed as a result of that incident. And I've worked on this for a very, very long time. I'm sorry, Errol, ask me again what you'd like me to discuss, because I'm going to go everywhere.
Just the situation, because I've got stats. I read that,
Right.
Over 1,100 people die by guns every year, that there's a financial cost to that as well. Just to give folks a sense of what is happening there.
Well, here in Arizona, I think one of the most discouraging moments for me here in Arizona came immediately following the Tucson January 8th shooting, where Gabby Giffords was injured along with many others, and we saw a number of deaths. And within a month of that, folks who had been her colleagues in my state House of Representatives moved to create a state gun. Rather than deal with the issue of gun violence. And here in Arizona, we've been working on this for a very long time. The last thing we did of significance was a bill called Shannon's Law that said that if you fire a gun into the air in a municipal area, that's a crime. That was the last thing of significance we were able to do. We remain deeply entrenched along strict party lines on even the most sensible gun safety measures here in Arizona, but we're going to keep going until we get it done.
I read that in the Arizona Child Fatality Review in 2022, firearm deaths surpassed drug overdoses and car wrecks, and are now the #1 killer of kids ages 15 to 17. Do those kind of numbers shift the conversation, or even get the attention of lawmakers in a sustained way?
Unfortunately, those statistics haven't mattered to my colleagues. And honestly, Errol, that statistic has stood in Arizona since I believe 2012, that gun fatalities have been the leading cause of death in Arizona's children since, for more than a decade. I feel that Arizona has been that place where the extremist gun lobby has come to build their most extreme gun laws. And once they get them right in Arizona, they've then proliferated them out into the nation. And so we've had a lot of work to do to break that particular strategy. My colleagues still are introducing bills to allow you to bring your loaded firearm onto your child's school campus at pickup. And the answer from most of my colleagues to event after event of gun violence is we need to loosen our gun laws and bring more guns into public spaces in Arizona.
And so when I read that the ATF says that 84% of guns used in crimes in the state are purchased within the state, are the gun sellers and manufacturers active, or is this sort of the national lobbying voice that we've heard so often?
Well, it is the more extreme gun lobby. The NRA has an outsized voice here in Arizona. And they're the ones, I believe, who are working with my colleagues across the aisle to ensure that even the most common sense measures, a simple safe storage measure, can't get heard because of my colleagues across the aisle who refuse to engage in this conversation.
Okay, let's shift to the Midwest and talk to Sasha Cotton, the Senior Strategy Director of the National Network for Safe Communities. But before we get into what you're doing with the National Network, I did want to ask you a little bit about your work directing the Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention. What are some of the strategies that you would like the rest of us to know about that seemed promising out of Minneapolis?
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, and to John Jay for putting together this impressive panel. I was at the city level in Minneapolis for several years during the development of the Office of Violence Prevention. I was the inaugural director, and I think, so much of the work of violence prevention is and should be focused on gun violence because that is what puts our entire communities at risk. And our focus has been very much on community violence and community gun violence. And some of the strategies that we lifted up in Minneapolis were the group violence intervention, which is at the national network where I am now, the National Network for Safe Communities, but also violence interrupter work and hospital-based violence intervention work, because we know so much of community violence is driven by the retaliatory nature of community violence. And so being able to interrupt those cycles, which all three of those strategies do well, and really lean into credible messengers, folks from communities most impacted by violence, really lending their voice, expertise, and experience to working with, unfortunately, mostly young Black and Brown men and women who are impacted by gun violence on a daily basis in communities across the country, including Minneapolis. And so that work continues. Our partnership with the National Network in Minneapolis continues, both in Minneapolis and St. Paul, as well as with partners at the Hobby who help to think about hospital-based intervention, and partnerships with places like Cure Violence to think specifically about violence interruption and how we can do that street level work to prevent and intervene in gun violence.
In your experience, are there hard numbers about the efficacy of violence interrupters? It got bumped up to a national strategy fairly quickly. And I've worked with reporters. In fact, I taught a seminar of graduate students, and we were sort of crawling the country data-wise, trying to find hard statistics and metrics. What did you settle on, and what kind of numbers can you tell us about?
Yes, I mean, I think that this is a question that gets posed quite often, particularly from reporters and from policymakers about the efficacy and proof of the work. And what we know is that, the work has existed on paper for roughly 30 years, comparatively speaking to institutions like law enforcement who have had hundreds of years to prove their efficacy and still continue to be funded out in an absorbent way compared to violence prevention. And what we know is that the violence still ebbs and flows, right? What we know when we think about violence intervention is that these strategies are effective and have been proven through research to be effective at helping to prevent and interrupt the retaliatory nature of violence. And we also know that prevention is hard to prove. It's hard to prove how many people didn't die because violence interrupters are out there. But I think both the research and really common sense and practice in communities of color in particular demonstrate that folks who are closest to the violence, who have experienced it themselves, who have the relationships and the reach, can really have an impact on keeping communities safer. Those are historical practices that go back to ancient civilizations in African American, American Indian, Latino, and really all communities when we think about conflict resolution and de-escalation. And that really, at its best, these strategies need to be seen as a critical complement to law enforcement strategies that have long been seen as the only resolution. And what we know is that while law enforcement is critically important in responding to violence, they don't alone interrupt or prevent violence. And that is really the important role that violence interrupters and other critical messengers play in a violence prevention ecosystem.
Right. And then also, Sasha, you mentioned hospital-based interventions. What do those look like? Does this involve health personnel? What, and I assume this is sort of on the emergency room end of things. What does that look like?
Yeah, so it varies from place to place, but the thing that is consistent is this idea of credible messengers and people with experience and reach being anchored in hospitals and being able to respond to incidents of critical violence, largely incidents of gun violence, and being able to, one, respond in a way that might be different from traditional hospital care. In Minneapolis in particular, what we saw was that oftentimes families and loved ones who are coming in because someone has been injured are having quite naturally a visceral response to the potential of having lost a loved one. That sort of perception of an animated response can accelerate hospital staff to feel like it's dangerous. They don't want those people in the hospital. So hospital-based responders are working with families and loved ones of those who have been injured. They're also transmitting communication between the surgeons and what's happening during surgery to the family, and then long-term providing a bedside intervention to the victim, both around how to navigate and get the best critical care in the hospital for their wounds and injuries, but also that anti-retaliation message around, you know, the violence has to stop. We want to help you. We want to serve you, get you to a place where retaliation isn't an option. We want you to be a messenger to your friends to not retaliate. And we're here to help you get on a trajectory that moves you away from the violence. And so that message is consistent, I think, whether we're talking about hospital-based work and that happening in ERs and hospital rooms, the credible messengers and the street outreach work, that same message is permeating. And then with the group violence intervention, that's often happening through systems and working with folks who are having contact with probation, parole, and law enforcement, and sending that same consistent message that the violence is unacceptable. We're here to help you. We need to get you on a trajectory away from violence.
Okay. I want to move now to Michael Sean Spence, the Managing Director of Community Safety Initiatives at Everytown for Gun Safety. And Michael, I was especially interested to hear about the Everytown Community Safety Fund, how you select different local projects to invest in, and what that experience has been like.
Well, echoing the previous statements, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for including me in this important conversation. The Everytown Community Safety Fund has only been in existence for about 4 years. Proudly, we've been able to scale our program from supporting 11 organizations in 11 cities in 2019 to supporting 117 in 67 cities 4 years later. The programs that we're supporting are implementing strategies very similar to the ones that Sasha just detailed. Evidence-based, community-based violence intervention programs, implementing strategies like street outreach, hospital-based violence intervention, but also strategies like group violence intervention that the National Network for Safe Communities is an expert in. Also group violence, cognitive behavioral therapy focused on youth, as well as more innovative approaches like summer youth employment and other strategies that open up access to opportunity for our most vulnerable kids and communities. We go about our process by starting with folks that are in the cities that are already experiencing high levels of gun violence. We start with our data to inform us, FBI data, local police data to the extent available, identifying those with the most critical issues. And then we talk to folks within those communities, starting with our volunteers, our more than 10 million moms and students that demand action every single day at City Hall and state houses, but also our advisory board of survivors, academics, and advocates, as well as the prior panelists on the panel before us, Erica Atwood, also serves on our advisory board, an individual who's in charge of leading a city's effort, Philadelphia, that is, their effort to reduce gun violence. So we're informed by a number of different information streams. And then we look at a lot of organizations very intently and deeply engaging more than 100 or so every single year, directly, as well as looking online and looking at public information that's available to identify the programs that are in the cities, but that are also focused on those hyper locales within cities that experience the highest levels of gun violence, that are implementing strategies that we know work. So we go through a process of about 6 months before we afford folks access to our program. In addition to increasing the total number of recipients, we've also increased our offerings. We started with just one program, our support grant, our largest grant. When the pandemic hit, we created a response program where we afforded $10,000 in emergency funding to more than 21 groups across the nation to help them sustain during that urgent moment. We've also launched a micro cohort grant, recognizing that it's the local ecosystems that can drive change and sustain it forward, but that there are a number of different cities out there. There are cities like New York and Chicago and DC that have very mature and refined local ecosystems of CVI orgs, as well as those working in intersectional spaces. But then you have other cities like Atlanta, as an example, that have a persistent issue, but an emerging infrastructure. So how do we incubate in places that need to further mature, and how do we fuel collaboration and cohesion amongst those immature ecosystems? And then we're also now supporting innovation, recognizing the increased impact gun violence is having on emerging demographics. I'm talking about Native Americans. I'm talking about Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders. I'm talking about the LGBTQIA community, particularly transgender community, and the increased impact on them. So how do we identify organizations that are working in those spaces to build their capacity to integrate gun violence prevention, to target them to the communities where that is being disproportionately experienced? So that's how we've built our program, and to date supported, as I mentioned, 117 to the tune of $10.6 million. And notably, I would say, and something that I share with government and that a number of cities have already adopted, Philadelphia, another example, we provide unrestricted dollars. One of the core issues and barriers that community-based programs have is that they're under-resourced. And many of the grants they get from government are tied to current or future programs that require they scale up to be able to pull those dollars down, as well as incur those expenses to then be reimbursed. Many of them don't have the dollars to put out. Hence, they cannot access those opportunities. So we've created our program to be equitable as well as accessible by providing an opportunity for folks, whether big or small, mature or emerging, to be able to get our support and utilize it as a lifeline for whatever they may need in that urgent moment.
So now when grassroots advocacy and activism runs into a conflict or a barrier, or even frankly a dead end at the state house or even in the courthouse, what do you do about that?
That's a great question. So one barrier that we have tried to navigate, which has only been exacerbated by the recent decision from the courts about the use of someone's prior arrest for domestic violence as the basis for removing a firearm. We recognized that as an issue years ago when it was already being done state by state, but we saw there were a number of judges that actually were not requiring those who should have been prohibited to forfeit their firearms. Our starting point was, let's learn more. We launched a court monitoring program in Texas, in Rhode Island, in several states. We trained our volunteers to go into these courts. We trained them what to look for. We developed surveys, and then we engaged the courts directly. We made immediate change. In the courts in Rhode Island, as an example, a number of those judges did refine their approach. They started requiring more folks. They started speaking from the bench, and they afforded more survivors access to safety by ensuring that the firearms were no longer accessible to their offenders. But elsewhere in states like Texas, where there is no law in the books, we found judges that were willing to be advocates from the bench. Folks who were willing to take the opportunity in front of folks to say, no, I'm requiring it in my individual capacity and judicial discretion to require you to remove your firearm as a component of this stay away order. And we've seen that be incredibly effective. So that's just an example of how we address these sort of issues.
Okay. I want to remind folks who are watching, I think we're upwards of 100 folks who are checking all of this out. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in order to submit a question. We're going to bring you into the conversation in a few minutes. But first, I want to ask each of the panelists, and I'll actually, let's see what I have here. I wanted to ask each of our panelists, and I'm going to start with you, Michael Sean, about your experience with media, and in particular, an example of media coverage that worked, that from your point of view, that framed the issues properly, framed the narrative in a way that you think advanced the cause of understanding and tackling the scourge of gun violence.
Great question. And I have had an opportunity to serve as the spokesperson for Everytown, so I've had a lot of experience across the nation. And I will tell you, the one piece that I was able to contribute to that immediately comes to mind is a New York Times article that came out in 2020. The title is "What's Behind the Recent Rise in Shootings?" This is at the height of the pandemic, when many folks were grappling with understanding whether this was a moment or whether this would be sustained into the future. A lot of folks were trying to understand what's driving this exponential increase. And I should note for those who are on the call, we saw the largest one-year increase in gun homicides between 2019 and 2020 of an average of more than 30% across the nation, even higher in certain cities when you look at their local data. Not only that, but as was mentioned earlier by a number of folks, 2020 was also the year gun violence became the leading cause of death for children and youth across the nation. This was due to that exponential increase. The article that I was able to contribute to did an expert analysis of some of the drivers, the driver of the pandemic, the loss of trust and credibility in law enforcement following high-profile police killings. They made a note of the increased access to firearms. We saw more than 20 million firearms fly off the shelves in 2020. They made a note of that. And then they also turned back to the solutions that are already underway, particularly in cities. They discussed the tensions that cities are trying to navigate between additional investment in law enforcement and traditional public safety models in the throes of that urgent crisis moment, while also understanding and appreciating the need for additional investment in communities. And at the conclusion, we all came to the agreement that there's so much more that needs to be done. One, to echo what Sasha said, to support community-based violence intervention, not as a replacement, but as a supplement to law enforcement, recognizing the complexities of reducing violence and the need to expand that burden to be shared by those who are, as Sasha mentioned, closest to the problem, hence the solutions. And that was a huge bellwether moment where I then heard from a number of mayors in cities saying, let's talk more. How do we develop a comprehensive strategy where we can continue to support those traditional models while integrating community violence organizations in an effective way to ensure implementation of their strategies? But even more importantly, and we're starting to see a number of cities get this right, more cohesion, coordination, and collaboration between community and government so that we can approach this together in a comprehensive way. But that article was a great example of how we can use our media partners, work with our media partners rather, to start these critical conversations and point people in the right direction so we can support the solutions that we know work.
Okay, Representative Longdon, I had the same question for you. I mean, I've been doing journalism for upwards of 40 years at this point. And, there are a lot of different tendencies in the profession that lead us to just kind of frame a debate as, well, the one side says this, the other side says something else, and you end the story and just move on. Rather than simply critique that, which we can all do all day, I wondered if you had an example of where you think journalists kind of got it right and really framed this issue properly in a way that might be an example to some of the journalists who are watching now.
Yeah, I think Michael Sean has given a great example, and I think one of the challenges we have is the loss of long-form journalism in a lot of spaces, and also in many cases, the loss of very local journalism is also making it much harder to tell this story time and time again. Here in Arizona, I think that There's been a lot of great work done. The no notoriety movement started here, or has been spearheaded by families here. Karen and Michael Teebs, whose son Alex was murdered in Aurora, have done a great job of helping us educate media on the need to be survivor focused or victim focused rather than on the salacious aspects of the shooter themselves. I think that's been very helpful. And here in Arizona, especially with like the anniversaries of the what we call the January 8th shooting, what many folks refer to as the Gabby Gifford shooting, which in and of itself frames that particular event in a way that erases all of the other folks who were impacted. So I think, but in seeing that done with great profiles of not only the loss experienced in that moment, but what has happened ever since. I participated in a great piece done, long form again, that was done by Mother Jones on the cost of gun violence and what it costs not only in the moment, but in terms of, you know, a lifetime of what it means for a family or community to have been impacted, victimized by gun violence, the loss of wages, the cost of modifications, all of those other issues that impact a survivor's life thereafter. And if I could, since I have the floor for a second, I'm going to share one of my pet peeves, and it is a tendency by media to somewhat sugarcoat this by talking about people who were lost. No one was lost. We're not going to find them, you know, accidentally in Disney World. They were murdered, they were stolen, they were killed. And then secondarily, our focus solely on those who have died in gun violence. That is absolutely tragic. We must note that. But for every person who is murdered, who dies as a result of gun violence, 2 more are wounded and survive. And for those individuals, there's not a happily ever after. And we need to continue to look at the cost, not only the deep personal cost to those individuals, but to the community, to the family, and to our nation for this ongoing public safety epidemic.
Point very well taken. Sasha, I wanted you to weigh in on this as well. An example of a good framing, an important way to, or at least non-destructive way of covering the issues that you would like to share with us.
Yes, thank you. I absolutely got a crash course in working with the press when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. And so this is an issue that is certainly important. And as we saw significant increases in violence and then violence prevention and intervention funding in Minneapolis in that summer of 2020, there was, of course, interest from the public and then from the press. One of the things that I think was really helpful to us was investigative journalism that was willing to come out and actually see the work in person and form opinions that they could share with the public based on those experiences. So often people are framing the context of the work based on the opinions of others or based on what they've read or one-to-one interviews. But I think there is real value in, for example, Tom Lydon in Minneapolis has done a lot of investigative journalism around violence interrupters and the violence prevention work in Minneapolis, and really showing the humanity and the reasons that people who are most impacted really do have a critical role to play in the work, and talking to those people on the front lines and seeing them do their work while providing cover and protection for the individuals that we're serving, has been very, very helpful to painting a clearer picture of what the work looks like and trying to remove some of the politics from it that so often get framed up in the press.
Absolutely, absolutely. John, while I assume some of your colleagues in the office probably deal more with the media, I was wondering if you could point, and frankly, I don't think of your guy as getting any bad press whatsoever, but speaking more to the issue, what are some examples of media that you think were helpful in advancing public understanding of gun violence?
Definitely. Thanks, Errol. Yeah. So some of my colleagues are definitely much more involved with the media cycle and media operations. I'll say that from my perspective and working with the congressman, one of the things that we really try and focus on is when, well, essentially at the federal level, a lot of folks are just entirely trying to avoid the conversation, and I think we do a lot of work with media to try and ensure that the conversation about gun violence prevention isn't avoided, that folks are on the record and that folks are kind of put under a lot of pressure to have to respond when things happen. And an example of this I think of is, for example, the situation that happened at the Tennessee legislature. There were a whole bunch of intersecting issues. However, the media that we worked with really focused on ensuring that the part that's at the core that was about gun violence prevention, and that a lot of other issues of democracy and racism were all intersecting there. That remained a core part of what was being communicated. And so that's kind of one of the things that one of the really bright shining moments that for me working with media of them really communicating that narrative, and what I would, if I could, point to for other folks that are thinking about examples like that.
Yeah. Another reminder, you should put your questions in the Q&A, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And there's lots of great questions. Actually, I want to take one of them. This is from Maya, who says, pointing attention to the shooting at Morgan State University in Baltimore just yesterday evening, what are some steps we can take to protect college campuses specifically? How does this differ from the ways we do or should protect elementary, middle, and high school campuses? Who would like to take that first? It sounds like an Everytown kind of a question, Michael Sean.
I'll weigh in first. Well, first and foremost, what a tragic shooting. Details still developing, looking forward to learning more. And that's the first step, obviously, whether you're an activist or nonprofit or a journalist, just learning the details first before we engage. There are a number of strategies that are already being employed, particularly as you make that comparison to elementary, middle, and high school strategies that are community-based, like safe passage programs that ensure safety to and from schools. We're seeing a number of cities, Baltimore included, starting to integrate traditional strategies into innovative settings. So they've already introduced street outreach programs into the school settings in a pilot this year. We also see that here in Mount Vernon, New York, and a number of other cities that are starting to innovate and think about how we can utilize the effective strategies to target where the gun violence is happening disproportionately. But as we take a step back, and I'm thinking about your prior question, Errol, there was another article that I contributed to with the New York Times. I want to say it's the end of 2022. A look at the increase in shootings at high schools, particularly during sporting events, something that has impacted a number of cities. Additionally, gun violence impacting graduations. We've seen some high-profile incidents there as well. There's a need for additional awareness of the impact gun violence is having on our kids. We've already talked about how it's the leading cause of death, but it's also impacting their matriculation rates, their ability to complete school, their testing scores, their ability to then access opportunity. We're talking about protective factors that are being ripped away from our most at-risk vulnerable kids, which is putting them on a path towards a reliance on violence. So by having a better understanding, not only of the impact gun violence is having on our kids, but how that is happening disproportionately in Black and brown communities. And we have analysis available on the Everytown website that I encourage people to take a look at. We should have already been having this conversation. So that's the first step, increased awareness and understanding and appreciation for how gun violence is impacting our youth on and off the school campus, and then engaging with folks to see how we can tailor some of the strategies we know already work to have more impact in the places where gun violence is happening. So that's just an example of how we could start.
Representative Longdon, do you have anything to add on that? The issue of college campuses in particular?
Well, again, Michael Sean has really nailed it. Michael Sean, I don't really need to say anything. I can leave. You can just do all the talking. You've got it now. But, when I woke up this morning and heard the news, I had two thoughts. First off, what was the genesis of this particular incident? Because gun violence isn't one thing. And until we're ready, certainly we need to deal with the issue. And the issue is guns, right? The ready access to guns. If this person had shown up with a brick or a bat or bad words or a knife, we might be looking at something entirely different. So at the core, we have to address the guns. Then we have to get to the root causes that lead folks to think that picking up a firearm and pointing it in a direction is the solution. But the other issue I thought about, and Michael Sean, you again covered it, is my second thought beside, what had happened here specifically is who's now going to leave school as a result of this shooting? Whose parents are now going to call them home because they're not going to leave their precious baby at risk? Whose career trajectory, life trajectory has been changed because this event happened on their campus or at, another campus. It's too unsafe for you to be at school, baby, you're coming home. Lives were changed, not just those who were immediately impacted or witnessed this, but everyone in that community, everyone who is part of the broader community of college students has been affected by this shooting.
There's a question from Sadie. Can any of you talk about policy and solutions focused on offenders? I'm wondering about recidivism, restorative justice, post-conviction reentry, etc. And Sasha, that sounds like the kind of work that you've been involved in.
Absolutely. So, early in my career, I worked in probation and parole prior to getting into violence prevention. And so this is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. I think one piece of it is, what are we doing with folks in prison prior to their release around education, employment readiness? So often, as I think about the work that I want to continue to do around prison reform, we send people to a place that feels very much like the Hunger Games and expect them to come home and be model citizens. And so I think as we think about preparation for reentry, we need to look at models like those in Germany and other places in Europe that are really preparing as soon as people enter a correctional facility for their release and what that release back into society is going to look like. So that's one thing. Then the other piece is the supportive nature upon release. So often we know that the institutions are not designed with the folks who are coming home in mind. They are designed to be rigorous and punitive and not designed to really focus on which to me is most important, violence prevention. They're largely focused around rules and restriction and the likelihood of returning you for the violation, probation violations, not actual recidivism. And we know that those restrictions can lead to people recidivating because it doesn't feel like they have a real chance to be successful. So I think there are models in Europe and Australia that we should be looking to for guidance on how to help support people successfully re-entering, because we know the vast majority of people who are incarcerated are coming home. And are they coming home to an environment set up for their success? And just quickly, while I have a moment on the Morgan State piece, one of my friend's daughters is a Morgan State student. And quite honestly, the news of what happened there last night was devastating. And this question of how will the National Office of Violence Prevention and other institutions work to support these kinds of issues, I think comes at a very critical time. How important it is when these kinds of things happen, what is the national response? And I think this national OVP, we're optimistic that it will provide those kinds of resources for our students because they need to be safe at school. So I'll pause there.
Right.
If I might add on to Sasha's initial point, I also want to amplify the fact that community-based violence intervention programs provide workforce development opportunities for returning citizens. And I think that's a part of the conversation that we have yet to hear loud enough, that we're creating jobs for people. And not only that, they're becoming executive directors and they're leading these programs. A core persistent issue is that we're seeing that there is not a long runway for these folks. They're plateauing. and they're not getting access to other opportunities in intersectional spaces. So by scaling CVI orgs and our national infrastructure, we can create more opportunity for folks just like them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's you know, it's interesting you should say that. I just moderated a panel where this very issue came up. You know, if you're doing violence intervention and it's never quite enough money and the organizations need to be strengthened and so forth, you know, I don't think anybody knew that this was going to be institutionalized to the point where, like, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, okay, what's the career path? What happens next? And there's certainly a lot of work to be done. You know, an example of building the airplane while you're trying to take off. Here's a question from Rachel. We learned about the gaps in criminal statistics reporting in our first panel today. How might that shape or complicate the work of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention? I'm going to ask you to take this, John Carter. How are you taking those statistic gaps into account?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. And I think part of
Yeah, we got you.
so part of the problem that the Office of Gun Violence Prevention is hoping to address are these gaps in data and statistics. And I think that highlighting these gaps and bringing attention to where the data is not available or where the data is not illustrative of the kinds of, you know, causal connections that would lead to sound policy decisions is part of what we want this office to produce as well, in addition to the sound policy recommendations that we can then you know, push out to folks to kind of to help support a lot of the more on the ground and with the community work that's super important. Bear with me, sorry.
Can I quickly add on to that, Errol?
You'll have to forgive me for a minute. That emergency alert that we all knew was coming bumped my my mic off for a minute, but go right ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Errol. For decades, we've had a prohibition on collecting data on gun violence nationally. And that has been done specifically to prevent us from crafting effective, well-reasoned, scientifically based policy. And now we're dealing with as we have seen the rise in gun violence in our nation. I believe it's a direct reflection of that inability to have collected effective data. Our best solutions are going to come based on the numbers and statistics rather than what we feel might be right.
I completely agree with you, Representative, as well. Yeah, and so, you know, when we think about things like PLACA and, you know, and things like, for example, one of the policies that we're really excited about is addressing, and it's kind of wonky, but I'm sure this crowd, you know, is in the know, but addressing merchant category codes. And I know, you know, at the state level, you know, so, you know, credit card companies have been able to kind of essentially use merchant category codes to try and mitigate folks who have purchasing behavior that resembles folks who are going to go and inflict violence. And then states pass legislation that punishes credit card companies that use those merchant category codes. And I think at the federal level, it's now you know, on us to take the step to undo that and to make sure that we're looking after our communities and ensuring that we can continue to take steps to ensure that data and information is available either for study or for immediate action to protect people.
Okay, folks, we're coming down the home stretch. We've got about 10 minutes left. You still have time if you want to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit a question. Here's one from Nikki. Here's a journalism question that addresses the multifaceted issue of gun violence, including suicides, replicas, and mandatory minimums. How can journalists play a role in not only unpacking the complex ramifications of increasing gun violence, especially in suicides, but also in covering cases involving replica firearms, toy guns, or finger-in-shirt gestures used in crimes? That's an interesting question. You know, there's no Second Amendment right to use a toy gun, but it is part of this question, isn't it?
I think it was North Bay News did a really wonderful piece, I thought, on ghost guns and dealing with replicas. And again, they did it with great storytelling around statistics and talked about how easily this journalist, who wasn't in any way able to do, he didn't consider himself handy or mechanical in any way, was able to take pieces he bought from around different marketplaces and assemble what turned out to be a fully automatic weapon. And this is a huge issue for us that we need to be addressing. So I think that the great storytelling that can be done, again, either in a local market or through long form, is what is missing. And I hope that we can see a lot more of that.
Yeah, if I can jump in. Oh, I'm sorry, Errol.
No, go ahead.
I was going to jump in on the issue of suicide. My home state of Minnesota, we hear a lot in the media and the press about the use of guns and community violence, but Minnesota has over 700 suicides a year in outstate Minnesota mostly, and that goes largely unaddressed by the press. And I think that this issue of internal, sort of inner city violence with guns and then the external issues around suicide at the state level has really been a unifier on the fact that guns and access to guns are the essential problem when we're talking about the way that guns show up as a vice in community. And Minnesota just invested $70 million into violence intervention with a particular focus on guns. And I think part of the reason that passed is because you could see how this is connecting the dots in all of Minnesota, not just on the issue of community violence, but on the issue of suicide. And we also know that the rate of suicide in communities of color is going up, and that there seems to be a connection between access to guns. And so I just think that this can be used, suicide versus homicide, looking at them at an intersection can really be used as a great unifier on this issue. And the press could do more to talk about that for sure.
If I may, Errol, Sasha speaking to suicide reminded me, again, gun violence isn't one thing and we have to quit looking at it that way. I think from a journalism point of view, a story that is yet to be told is talking about the greatest generation, those veterans who are now aging into, in some cases, dementia, who have their firearms and what is happening with those. I'm talking with church groups and community organizations here about what do I do with dad's guns? What is going to happen now? Dad sometimes, thinks that everyone is an intruder and he has, 6 firearms in the house. Now what happens? That's a story yet to be told as well as the suicide and all of the other issues we're looking at. Somebody jump on that.
Well, I would simply point out to all of the journalists who are watching, I mean, these folks, as you can tell, are a treasure trove of stories, so that, the proper way to do this is to build out your resources, build your connections, start the conversations before there's a mass shooting or a protest or a legislative fight that you have to cover, so that you'll have the kind of background and the depth and the anecdotes that you need to sort of tell a proper story. And then you can use whatever the latest news hook is to give you an excuse to sort of tell this broader story. I mean, this is a story that's not going to go away. It's been a major story for my whole adult life. Been writing or broadcasting stories about this every year for a generation and a half at this point. So certainly, I think I hope the wheels are turning. That the discussion so far has maybe given you some food for thought for a lot of this. Got a legal type question here. Has there ever been a case that seeks to define what a compelling state interest is? Why is it a compelling state interest when the government fights terrorism, for example, but not when it is fighting the COVID pandemic or gun violence? And Representative Longdon, you may have a point of view on that.
I have a point of view. I can't say that I know that there's been a legal case on this issue, but as I work here in Arizona, especially with my colleagues who preach fiscal conservancy, solving the issue of gun violence is fiscally conservative. The amount of money that we spend in public health, public safety, criminal justice, all the way around is huge, in multiple billions here in the state of Arizona. I believe when you really look at it, about a third of our budget can be boiled down to how it impacts issues surrounding gun violence in our schools, like I said, public safety, public health, criminal justice. And I believe that if we work to solve this as an issue, we will free up more money in our state budget for education, climate change, transportation, better roads, and light rail.
I know the politics are different, but in New Mexico, right next door, I was very intrigued to see the governor declare a state of emergency, and on that basis, to really impose some gun restrictions that could never make it through the legislature, and pretty much said up front she's willing to have that fight politically. Is that risky on her part? I mean, I thought it's just not what we're used to hearing from people in that position.
Well, it certainly sparked a conversation, didn't it? I don't know that if I were to advise my governor, and I'm not a key advisor, that I would advise her to take those same steps. But I believe that the governor of New Mexico certainly brought the issue to the forefront and looked at it in that more holistic manner in which the proliferation of gun violence has an overall effect on the state.
Okay. Folks, that brings us to the end of our time for this panel. I want to really, really thank all of you, especially those of you who were dragged in at almost literally the last minute. Sasha and John, thank you for joining us. Representative Longdon, Michael, Sean, thank you all so much. I want to mention that there's going to be a 10-minute break, and then we invite everybody to return in 10 minutes so that's going to be at 2:40 Eastern time, for the announcement of the annual prizes for excellence in criminal justice journalism. Thank you all so much. I've really enjoyed this.